So I gave my class today a provocative title with very little subtitle to it. I've had a few people say, oh, well, here's my favorite racy story from the Bible. And I've had other people say, this is not a personal reflections class, is it? Or reflection on things that people have told you in your office. And it's neither of those things. It is my effort to do a little bit of complexifying of the biblical story. Let me give you a little background. I once did a Bible study in another congregation with this same title. And I started with the story of David and Bathsheba, which has been coming up in our adult forum a couple of times over the last few weeks. Just to give you the little bit of primer, King David has an affair with Bathsheba. Bathsheba becomes pregnant. David sends Uriah, who is Bathsheba's husband, up to the front lines and then pulls the army back so that he is killed. And then he, David, can be the benevolent one who takes the pregnant Bathsheba into his household. I tell this story, and I go through it, and one of my parishioners at the time raises her hand in the questions time and says, that is not in the Bible. And I said, yes, unfortunately, it is. And what it reminds me of, and as we've talked about David over these last couple of weeks, we're so quick to idealize our biblical characters and say, well, David was the great king. David did these things. David was the ruddy runt of the litter who became the great king of Israel. Indeed, he was. But he was also one who had a complicated story. I think we don't do ourselves very many favors when we take those biblical characters and idealize them to be something so other than we are. Oh, well, I'm not as good as King David. Oh, well, I'm not like King Solomon. Oh, I'm not like Abraham or whatever. Because, yeah, we are. People who are gifted and talented and commissioned by God in one area with complicated, sinful lives in another area. We all live in that tension, and what I hope we'll do as we talk about these stories today is think about how did they resolve the tension, and how do we resolve the tension in our minds. It doesn't diminish who they were. It doesn't diminish what they did, but it gives us a more complete picture. When I was in seminary, I was a part of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, which is Bronx, Manhattan, Staten Island, and then everything sort of up Westchester County way until about Poughkeepsie, for those of you who are familiar with that geography. And one of the great heroes of the Diocese of New York was Bishop Paul Moore. Some of you may have heard his name. He was one of the sort of activists in the 70s and the 80s in New York when they were doing a lot of the cleanup efforts. He marched with Martin Luther King several times and was just one of those bigger-than-life personalities. Well, in his death, his daughter wrote a book, a section of which was published in The New Yorker, exposing all of these pieces of his past that hadn't been known. And there was this great media outcry, and people were asking the church for comment. And Bishop Mark Sisk, who was the Bishop of New York at the time, wrote a passage that I still remember almost 10 years later, more than 10 years later, from this coming out. And the bishop writes, though this book reveals our friend to have been a vastly more complex man than many of us who admired and respected him ever knew, there can be no diminution of his greatness, the nobility even of the purposes and the goals of his public life. We are left seeing a deeply flawed man in desperate need of God's merciful grace, as are we all. I think that's just the most wonderful way to approach these stories of biblical characters. It's also the case that the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, is full of a rich, rich character development. The writers of these books took time to develop these characters for us, and you can see patterns and threads running through them. A couple of folks asked me which of the many choices I was going to pick for men behaving badly, and there are a plethora of choices. But today I'm going to focus only on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. One family, 3 generations, who we are going to use Eucharistic Prayer C for this season of Epiphany, and you'll hear us pray about them today at the altar. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we hold them up in this way as our great patriarchs, and indeed they were, but complicated people nonetheless. So as we look at the stories of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob, I want us to take a moment to remember why it is that we hold them up. I want us to take a moment to look at some of the stories where they didn't do the best job that they could have done. And then I want us to try and trace some of those threads through and look for connections in our own lives. Fair enough? All right. So let's begin with Abraham. What was Abraham's original name? Abram, exactly. So he gets a name change when he starts coming further into his ministry. And what are the wonderful things for which we remember Abraham? You're going. Sorry, what? Nope, that's not one of the wonderful things for which we remember him, but I'm going to come back to that exact story. What's on the plus list for Abraham? Answering God's call, absolutely. God comes to him and says, Abraham, step out in faith and go to the land that I'm going to show you. And he leaves behind his family and he leaves behind his familiar land and he goes out. And you know what? God doesn't tell him where he's going. He just has to go. We also remember Abraham as one who was willing to make sacrifices for God. The most controversial story every time I've taught it in this parish is about the sacrifice of Isaac, when he's willing to let that only son, the one of his old age, the one who was the key to the promise, was willing to sacrifice him back to God. Set aside the question of child sacrifice for now and hold on to that key message that he was willing to do anything. There was no limit. Even that limit that would seem even unconceivable to the rest of us. There was no limit. Also, Abraham believed that the descendants that were promised to him were coming. He never lived to see them, by the way. He never met those 12 great-grandchildren who went on to populate the earth. But he believed they were coming. He believed it was possible. And he believed that God would do what he said. These are the things for which we remember Abraham. But then, as Brooke brought up for us, there is a slight twist in the story, and it comes in Genesis 12. This is Genesis 12, verses 10 to 20. I specifically did not give you text because I want you to hear it and hear those words. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. So say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male and female slaves, and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say that she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on the way with his wife and all that he had. Genesis 12. So do we follow this story? What's going on? They're going down into Egypt. Abram's got his beautiful wife. He knows that the Pharaoh is going to have his eyes on his wife, and the only way that the Pharaoh can have Sarah as his wife is to kill Abraham. So Abraham says, just don't tell him you're my wife. Just say you're my sister. And as a result of that, Abram gets all of these camels and goats and oxen and sheep and all of these things, and in the end gets to keep it. So he gets rewarded for that action. Now, you can imagine in seminary when we were in Hebrew class learning to translate, we're going through and we're trying to figure this out because all of the names are flip-flopping on us. The word that you expect to be, this is my wife, Sarah, is this is my sister, Sarah, going back and forth. And the professor sort of stopped us and said, the reason you're having trouble here is because Abraham is behaving abominably. And that is indeed correct. So that's what we've got. What do we make of it? What's your reaction to that story? Sorry? Self-preservation. It's all about Abraham here, right? It's all about, you say this so that it will be well with me. And then the writer goes on to tell us that it was very well with Abraham, and he got all of these wonderful material things. Mm-hmm. So God lets Pharaoh, and this is going to be important in the next story that I'm going to read you. God lets Pharaoh enter into this place of sin, but then curses him for it, right? And it seems to be in this series of stories that we're about to walk through that sleeping with somebody else's wife is the line that you can't cross. Lying is fine, sort of presenting things not as they are, totally fine. But sleeping with somebody else's wife, that's the no-go territory. But Abraham figures out how to preserve himself and even increase his wealth. Sorry. We can unpack that other part later. Increase his wealth. This is one of 3 wife-sister stories in the first chunk of Genesis. 2 of them are Abraham, and I'm going to read the next one in just a moment, and then one of them is Isaac. So we have a total of 3 times when it follows exactly this pattern in exactly this way. And it's useful to track them. Before we go further, though, let me read you the second story. The first was in Genesis 12. This is in Genesis 20, so sort of in the same neighborhood, but in the beginning of the text. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister,' and she herself said, 'He is my brother'? I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What were you thinking of that you did this thing?" And Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness that you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen, male and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham, and restored his wife Sarah to him. And Abimelech said, 'My land is before you, settle where it pleases you.' And to Sarah he said, 'Look, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is your exoneration before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. That's a slightly different flavor, isn't it, Barbara? We finally hear her voice. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're definitely seeing a statement about the role of women in biblical times, being able to be moved from person to person, taken as wife, given back and forth. We're also seeing Abraham sort of rationalizing the whole thing. Well, she is my sister, my half sister, and that's apparently okay in their culture. It's a little cozy for our culture. But she's my half sister, not my full sister, but is also my wife, and I just forgot to mention that part. What else? Compare and contrast those stories for me. He is rewarded again. He gets yet more assets out of this. Mm-hmm. God does not like Pharaoh. Talk to me a little bit more about that, Brooke. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. And we don't know from the text how it is that Pharaoh figures out why he's being afflicted. So it could be that God came and told him, this is what's going on, this is the problem, you have done this terrible thing. But in Abimelech's case, he stops him from sinning, and he gives him credit for not knowing what he was doing. Pharaoh had the same problem. Pharaoh also didn't have full information, but God didn't have very much time for that. Well, what we certainly know is that God's relationship with Pharaoh and God's relationship with Abimelech is different. And we can sort of speculate as to what that might be, but I think that's going to be our core truth, is that God interacts with them differently. As I'd mentioned to you, we have a persistence of form and times when the form is adjusted, and we certainly will then connect in Exodus to God's interactions with Pharaoh in an interesting way. And if you go back and look really closely at the Exodus text, when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go, there are several times when it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and there are several times when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so this interesting dance between God and Pharaoh is introduced to us pretty early on. It's also the case that we have the Abraham family going in and out of Egypt. And we're going to see that a little bit more as we do some more of this story. But over the course of the first 5 books, the Torah, we're going to see this family go in and into Egypt, out of Egypt, into Egypt, out of Egypt. They go into Egypt as aliens. They become very powerful. Then a new Pharaoh comes in and they become very weak. And then we have the whole story of them trying to come out into the wilderness, and then they're journeying to the promised land. And we have that back and forth that's introduced already in the first part of Genesis. What else? Anything else? I'm sorry? Mary and Joseph go there too. In one of the accounts of the gospel, they don't go back to, in one account, they go to Jerusalem to dedicate the child in the temple. In the other account, they flee into Egypt. And we had talked about that a few weeks ago when we did the birth narrative. God appeared to Joseph in a dream and called him out of Egypt, or called him into Egypt in the same way that God appeared to Joseph the dreamer there. Steve? Steve is raising a really good feminist critique of the text, whereas you look at it and you see God looking out for the women that he's chosen to sort of lift up. For those of you who were here for my birth narrative class on Matthew, there were those 5 women who appeared in Jesus' lineage, and all of them were racy for some reason. There was some reason that they shouldn't have been in the perfect line of Jesus, but yet they were. And same here. We have a patriarch who is doing absolutely the wrong thing, and God is finding a way to give voice to the woman, and is finding a way to make a bridge over those foibles for his patriarch. It is troubling, isn't it, that God did not protect Sarah the first time in the same way that he protected her the second time. Definitely a troubling piece. One of the things that I've always felt a special identification with Abraham as one who was called away from the geographical place that he knew to be home, to go to a geographical place that God was calling him. And that's a really profound story for me, and to sort of track that. But God made him wait. As Milton just said, nothing came fast. Isaac was the child of his old age to his barren wife. You remember Isaac itself means laughter, because when God said that Sarah was going to have a child, she fell on the ground and laughed. And then there's that wonderful exchange where God comes back and says to Sarah, "Why did you laugh?" And Sarah says, "Oh, I didn't laugh." And God says, "Yeah, you laughed. I'm God. I know these things." And that's in the Bible too. This provides us a really good sort of transition to the stories around Isaac. It does, from a modern view, it is rather impressive that Sarah stuck around. But from an ancient view, it's not. Because to be on your own, to be separated out, is to be not protected by the community, is to have no voice, is to have no place. And that's an important piece for us to hold on to. When we transition into Isaac now, which is one generation down, when we have this son of the old age, we have the son who is promised, we have the son who is then asked to be sacrificed, and then on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. We don't get a lot of detail about Isaac in his adult life. We get a wife-sister story, and I'm not going to go through it again because it follows almost exactly the same, but he also has his wife say, "You are my sister, not my wife." And we have a repetition of form around Isaac. So again, we have a barren wife who does not give birth until her old age. We have Isaac living in Gerar under the reign of King Abimelech. Remember from Dad's indiscretion. We have a wife-sister story with Abimelech here, who apparently did not learn from the previous time and saying, okay, well, his dad gave me this woman who looked an awful lot like his wife, but he said he was his sister and it got me in trouble. But now the son is here and I'm sure that's his sister, even though I didn't actually meet any sisters when I had met the father. So Abimelech apparently did not learn his lesson, giving us a model of people who fall into the same traps over and over again. And how many of us can identify with that? Every intention of not doing that again, but then falling into that same pattern again and again. Isaac is one of two sons. Isaac's brother is Ishmael, his half-brother, who goes on to be the ancestor of the Arabs. And so we have Isaac, the ancestor of Jews, Ishmael, the ancestor of the Arabs. And we have, let me make sure I get this correct. But we have here an introduction now with Isaac and Ishmael of the chosen and the not chosen. Who are the chosen? Who are the not chosen? And that's a theme that starts to emerge here from the first time, or for the first time. When we look at Abraham's story, we don't know where he came from. He just sort of appears on the scene. And we know that he is a faithful man, and we know that he steps out when God asks him to. But we don't have him being chosen in contrast to someone else, which we do get in that next generation. Skipping Isaac's wife-sister story, we now get on to Jacob. Jacob, again, is one of two children, Jacob and Esau, exactly correct. One, again, will be chosen, one will be banished. We also start getting a theme of the unexpected one being chosen. That Jacob was the younger son, Esau was the older son. Esau should have had the birthright, Jacob should not have had it. How does Esau lose his birthright? We got two stories, and I conflated them myself until I went back and checked the text. The first one is the birthright, and that he sells for a bowl of soup because he's really hungry. And Jacob has soup and says, well, I've got soup. You've got a birthright. I'll give you soup, you can have birthright. So, well, what is good as my birthright if I'm going to die of hunger? And so he sells it off for that. We start getting a sense that Jacob may be one who wants to play the system a little bit. Well, then we fast forward, and Isaac is dying, and he says, and says to his son Esau, I want to bless you before I die. So go out and, don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm about to read that. One last thing, we do have a repetition of form here that Jacob ultimately ends up going back into Egypt. So we have this story again of into Egypt, out of Egypt, into Egypt, out of Egypt. Power in Egypt, losing power in Egypt. Things are going well, things are not going well. And that pattern continues itself. So here's the second half of that story, the one about the blessing. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here am I." And he said, "See, I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out into the field and hunt game for me. And then prepare for me a savory food such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die." Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game, bringing it in, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before I die.' Now, therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes, and you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. And she handed the savory food and the bread that she had prepared to her son Jacob. So he went in to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I've done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, so that you may bless me." Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you found it so quickly, my son?" And he answered, "Because the Lord your God has granted me success." And then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really Esau or not." So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him, and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, and so he blessed them. Tell me about this story. What are the characteristics of it? Yes, finding a way to accomplish your ends, your goals, without regard to moral justification in the midst of it. We have an identity theme going on, saying you're somebody that you aren't, which is an interesting piece of the story. Rebekah plays a very interesting role in this story that Sarah did not play in the previous stories, that she's the one organizing the system here. The scripture writers sort of give Jacob a pass. He was just doing what his mama told him to do, right? That's true. She did send Ishmael and Hagar away. I think it's a different sort of manipulation than we're seeing of Rebekah, but I can definitely see how she changed the circumstances. Tell me about Jacob's role here. Jacob's more suspicious than we've seen up till now in these stories. So Pharaoh doesn't learn until after the fact what's going on. Abimelech gets warned before the fact in the Abraham wife-sister story, and seems to have forgotten about it by the time we get to the Isaac wife-sister story. But Jacob here thinks he knows what's going on, but doesn't trust himself. "You sound like my other kid, but yet the food smells right. How did you do that so quickly? Oh, God blessed you. Okay, all right. Let me feel you, let me touch you," that sort of thing. And then Jacob gives up on his instincts. He had it figured out, but he doesn't trust himself when the evidence doesn't seem to add up. Isaac, excuse me. I'm sorry. Yeah. My eyes are gone, my ears must be going too, right? So I'm going to figure this out. I have a friend who I visit sometimes who's in his old age and can't see very well. And anytime someone comes into his room in his retirement community, he'll say, "Who's that?" And there's a trust there, isn't there, that you're going to answer truthfully. This is who I am. I know you can't see me, but I'm going to tell you the truth. And that trust, that sort of underlying trust that we would expect of one another, is violated here. Also violated is the trust between husband and wife in this sense, that one is not going to connive against the other to get her outcome. So what Steve's pointing out is that God needed, or Israel needed, to have certain skills in its leadership. And through this system, those skills were provided. That Esau might not have had the requisite skills to do what Isaac, I'm getting my names mixed up, forgive me that, needed him to do. What do you think about that? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And it's this question that the Protestant reformers were playing around with too. To what extent is God manipulating the system so as to achieve an outcome? To what extent is God not doing that? People will often say to me, well, everything happens for a reason. I don't know that I buy that, particularly when we're talking about a modern context. And when someone will say, oh, well, everything happens for a reason, God won't give me any more than I can handle, et cetera, et cetera. I don't hold that. For me, it's saying God is strong enough to redeem even this suffering, even this corruption, even this death. And in the midst of it, to not say, oh, well, God is testing me or God is growing me or something like that, but instead to say, this is really terrible. But my God is big enough and loving enough and wonderful enough that he will redeem even this. And that's the road that I tend to go down. We have people who are behaving dishonestly. We have people who are manipulating other people. We have people who are lying. And all of these people tend to then end up in our line of patriarchs, important people who did important work. And God, in my view, redeemed even that. Even this bad behavior got redeemed in the end. And that's a piece that is so encouraging to me, to say that in all those times when I don't do what it is that I think I should, or don't measure up to whatever standard it is that has been set, to say, neither did my ancestors. And God blessed and redeemed and used them, just as I hope he'll bless and redeem and use me. It's getting back to that King David thing, that we love to hold him up and then forget about this other piece. King Solomon was the great king who built the temple and brought justice and all of these things. He built his own house before he built the temple. Made it all nice, comfortable. But we miss those pieces when we just idealize these characters. And I think it's a lot more helpful to us as modern-day faithful people to remember the whole story and to see the rich character development going on. One just side note for reading the text, we have in this story of Isaac speaking to Jacob and to Esau the phrase, "Here I am." So one will say, "Where are you? Here I am." And that phrase repeats itself through the Old Testament. It's the same phrase, same Hebrew word that Moses answered to God from the burning bush. It's the same word that appears in the story of Samuel's calling. We've got all of these different references to when somebody calls out to you or when God calls out to you, you say, "Here am I." One of my favorite professors in seminary used to make us answer that way when she called the roll for class, and had to say, "Here am I, here am I." It was fun the first day. It declined in interest as the course went along. Before we run out of time, let's talk about who we'll call the boys. So we're now 3 generations hence. We have Abraham, and then Isaac, and Jacob, and then we have the tribes, the 12 tribes. So Abraham is promised descendants when we first meet him. He doesn't live to meet his grandchildren, nor his 12 great-grandchildren. So he lives his whole life in this promise of faith that he will have descendants. But he only gets one son of the line, and that son only has one son of this line, 2 sons. And then we get the tribes. So here we are, with the promise to Abraham being fulfilled long after his death. Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter by 4 mothers. Joseph and Benjamin were the favored children because they were the sons of beloved Rachel. So we remember the story here of Laban And the 2 daughters, you work 7 years, I'll give you my daughter. And then what does Laban do? Gives him the other daughter and puts a veil over her face so that he doesn't know which one he's just married. And then after they have consummated their relationship, he realizes that he's got the wrong person, and he goes back and he says, "What have you done?" And he says, "Well, what am I going to do if you send her back to me?" Yet another wonderful statement after a father has switched the daughters around to say she's useless to me now that you've married her, my goodness. All of that. So we have yet more bad behavior in this line. So Jacob works another 7 years to marry the beautiful Rachel. He does so. And the last 2 sons. Now remember, this is a great role reversal, isn't it? That we have the sons who are last in the line, who are not supposed to be the favored ones, becoming the ones through which all this story unfolds. We get the same thing, just as a side note, with King David. That he's the young one, he's the run to the litter, he's the ruddy one who his dad leaves out in the field when the prophet comes to say, "Show me all your sons." He has, I think, 9 sons. He brings 8 of them in. "Here are all my sons." And the prophet says, "But where? There's somebody's not here." He's like, "Oh, well, there's the kid out in the field, but I mean, you don't mean him, surely." But I did. "Surely you don't mean the youngest 2 of the sons." But he did. We have older sons being jealous of younger sons, like we saw with Esau and Jacob. We see another repetition of pattern that Joseph ends up going into Egypt under different circumstances, just like Abraham and Isaac before him. We see Pharaoh not being protected by God like Abimelech was when Joseph gets down there. We see Joseph first being protected and then not. And then we see a revisiting of God's relationship with Pharaoh, all wrapped up in these chapters of character development in Abraham's family. Thus goes the story of Joseph and his older brothers. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him because they were jealous. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum and balm and resin on their way to carry it down into Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "Bum, bum, bum. What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. And when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph into Egypt. All right, so Judah here has a little problem. He says, "What profit is it to us if we just kill him? Let's sell him instead, and then we'll get some money off of it." Not unlike his great-grandfather, who did the Sarah wife-sister thing and came out richer every time he did it. So finding a way to profit on this, we also see a specific price referenced. 20 pieces of silver gives us a little bit of context. We have 1,000 pieces of silver from Abimelech to Abram in the wife-sister story. We have 20 pieces of silver to the boys for Joseph. And then if you want to make a connection to the New Testament, which is always spotty when you're studying the Old Testament, but we have 30 pieces of silver from the chief priests to Judas to betray Jesus. So we get this measurement in silver and giving us specific details in the story. And isn't it interesting to whom Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery? Did you catch that detail? They saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. They saw a caravan of Ishmaelites, connecting us back to these folks who had been banished out, connecting us back to the unchosen ones. and giving God yet something more to redeem. But isn't it interesting how the bad behavior of Judah and his brothers, connected to the ones who had been banished out before, becomes the means by which God works his plan of salvation? These aren't perfect folks. These are the ones who said, well, we won't get any money if we just kill him. So how can we work that out? What are you hearing now that we've done the wife-sister stories, we've done the birthright story, we've now done the selling into slavery story? Brooke? Right, so we have the senior brother here. His line becomes very important when you come down. But then it's Benjamin's line that also becomes significant. There's a lot of sociology going on under the surface here about the line of agrarians, people who would settle and keep the farms and tend the sheep, and then the people who would go out into the field and hunt and come back. And that pattern repeats itself in our lives too, doesn't it? We've just sort of flipped it around, that it's the cities versus the country, right? And it's saying, well, we have all these wonderful amenities in the city, and we've figured out how to do all these things, but we wouldn't be eating unless there were people out in Fayette County and down in the Delta growing that food. But it's this tension back and forth that still exists today, isn't it? That what Lisa just shared is that so many of the pieces of this story are motivated by financial gain, which is another lesson for us to take into modern times. And isn't it interesting that, so when you say what he's stealing is the intangible promise, what I might sort of take that one step further, what motivates stealing is jealousy. And so what these people are jealous of is this promise, this lineage that's been promised. It's a wonderful insight. I hadn't thought about that before. We definitely need to talk about the role of women as we think about these stories, and Jesus being placed within the context of women, Matthew giving us women in his ancestry, women becoming the first witnesses to the resurrection in all four gospel accounts, then compared to the ancient view of women where they were property to be transferred here or there. It's very interesting also to then say, well, the guys didn't do a terribly great job while they were in charge. So it's not as though, oh, well, the women don't have a role to play because the men are so benevolent and so kind and have it all figured out. That does not hold to the scriptural text that we have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point, that to suggest that the birthright or the blessing is humanity's to give and that God is going to honor it. You sold it for a bowl of soup, but it's yours anyway. Interesting. Jillian. So that Jillian's point is that he didn't place appropriate value on what he had, which is also a very important element that carries through. What is the value of this? Do we cherish it? Do we honor it? This trust, this promise that we've been given. Let me read again where we started, the comment by the Bishop of New York. Though this book reveals our friend to have been a vastly more complicated man than many of us who admired and respected him ever knew, there can be no diminution of his greatness, the nobility even of the purposes and the goals of his public life. We are left seeing a deeply flawed man in desperate need of God's merciful grace, as are we all. I think that grabs these stories in so many ways. We're not going to flatten these guys out. We're not going to idealize them into something greater than they were. I think that's what Ted Kennedy said of his brother Bobby in his memorial eulogy. We don't need to expand him in death larger than he was in life. That's worthy to hold on to. They're complicated people. They're imperfect people. So are we. God used them and God will use us. And to hold on to that and to think about what place we might have in that lineage, I think is the legacy of these ancestors. So in a few minutes when we're in church and Ben prays to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you can all get a little smirk with me as we do it, because that's our lineage. Jesus was the descendant of rogues and prostitutes. Abraham and his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandchildren did terrible things, but yet God used them, and God will use us. And the people said, Amen.